What if Magneto arrived in Warhammer 40k? When the man made of metal appeared above the ruins of Cadia, the Imperium didn't know whether he was a Xenos god, a warp aberration, or the opening shot of another extinction. He hung suspended in the ash-thick air like a prophet descending from ancient myth, his cape rippling in winds that carried the screams of a trillion dead souls. Below him, the 881st Cadian Regiment was 3 minutes into a firefight with a Chaos warband when every weapon on the battlefield simply stopped. Bolters froze mid-fire, chainswords locked in their housings, a Lehman Russ battle tank, mid-charge, ground to a halt as if the machine spirit itself had been strangled. In the sudden silence, 100 guardsmen looked up and saw him. A man, just a man, floating, waiting, and every piece of metal on that battlefield began to tremble. The Vox network exploded with panic. "Command, this is Delta 79er. We have contact with unknown hostile. Designation unclear. Repeat, designation unclear." The voice cracked with the kind of fear that even veteran guardsmen rarely show. A tech priest embedded with the regiment began screaming binary cant into his wrist-mounted data slate, his augmetic eyes flickering with error codes. Unauthorized magnetokinetic field detected. Electromagnetic interference magnitude. Impossible. Impossible. Behind the front lines, a junior commissar reached for his bolt pistol and found it ripped from his holster, spinning upward into the sky like a leaf caught in a storm. 30 seconds later, every metal object within 2 kilometers was floating. Dog tags, buttons, spinal augmetics. The guardsmen watched their own weapons drift away from them like ghosts abandoning a grave, and the man in the sky hadn't even moved. Magneto looked down at the battlefield with the calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, human. As pointing weapons, humans shouting orders, humans preparing to kill him for being different. He had spent a lifetime turning humanity's tools of oppression into instruments of liberation. Guns, tanks, missiles, nuclear warheads. All of it was just metal, and metal obeyed him the way gravity obeyed reality. He raised one hand, fingers splayed wide, and every weapon on that field compressed into a single mass of screaming steel. The sound was like a cathedral collapsing, barrels twisted into corkscrews, ammunition cooked off in chains of muffled detonations. When he clenched his fist, the entire arsenal compacted into a sphere the size of a rhino transport, glowing red from compression heat. He let it drop. It hit the ground like a meteorite, and the shockwave knocked 24 guardsmen off their feet. "I have come to speak with your leaders," Magneto said, his voice amplified by the resonance of the metal around him, carrying across the wasteland like the voice of a god. "I will not be met with weapons. I will not be met with threats. Humanity has spent too long building cages for those it fears. That ends now." He descended slowly, boots touching scorched earth, and the guardsmen scrambled backward like prey animals, realizing they were cornered by something apex. A sergeant, braver or more foolish than the rest, raised a las pistol. Magneto didn't even look at him. The pistol melted in the man's hand, superheated by an induced current, until the grip turned molten. The sergeant dropped it with a scream, clutching his burned palm, and Magneto walked past him without acknowledgement. He had delivered this speech before. He had toppled governments, shattered armies, humbled nations. This was just another world that needed to learn the same lesson. But this was not another world, and the Imperium was not just another nation. 300 kilometers above Cadia's surface, an inquisitorial surveillance station recorded the event in grainy pict feed and immediately flagged it for Ordo Xenos review. The flagging algorithm noted, "Unauthorized reality manipulation, 0 warp signature detected, threat level escalating." Within 6 minutes, the data was on the desk of Inquisitor Craven, a man who had spent 40 years cataloging horrors that could end civilizations. He watched the feed twice, then he activated a priority Vox channel and spoke 4 words that would seal Magneto's fate. "Alert the Grey Knights." Somewhere in the warp, a strike cruiser changed course. Its hull was inscribed with wards that could burn demons from reality. Its cargo hold contained warriors who had killed gods. On the surface, Magneto stood among the wreckage of Imperial steel and waited for someone with authority to arrive. He had no idea that authority in the Imperium didn't negotiate. It didn't reason. It didn't compromise. In the 41st millennium, there was only war, and anything that disrupted the war effort was either a resource to be exploited or a threat to be annihilated. The Administratum would classify him, the Mechanicus would study him, the Inquisition would judge him, and if he resisted, the Imperium had weapons that made magnetism look like a child's toy. Cyclonic torpedoes that cracked continents, Exterminatus-class warheads that boiled atmospheres, vortex weapons that opened holes into unreality itself. Magneto had moved mountains, the Imperium moved planets. A cold wind blew across the Cadian wastes, carrying with it the ash of a billion martyrs. Magneto pulled his helmet tighter and waited. He had faced persecution his entire life, survived concentration camps, outlived enemies, reshaped nations. He had seen humanity at its worst and believed, even now, that he could make it better. But humanity in the 41st millennium wasn't interested in better. It was interested in survival. And survival meant sacrificing 1,000,000 worlds so 1,000,000 more could burn just a little longer. The guardsmen watched him from a distance, whispering prayers to the God Emperor, clutching holy symbols, marking him as heretic, as witch, as monster. They didn't see a liberator, they saw a threat, and in the grim darkness of the far future, threats didn't get trials. Magneto had come to reshape humanity. In the 41st millennium, humanity was about to teach him what reshape really meant. If you want to see how the master of magnetism survives in a galaxy where metal is the least of your worries, where gods bleed and empires span 1,000,000 worlds, then stay with us. Because this is just the beginning, and the Imperium never forgets, it never forgives, and it never, ever stops. Subscribe if you want to see what happens when power meets a universe that doesn't care about power. Like if you think Magneto stands a chance. And comment below, could he survive a Titan? Could he bend a Necron? Or is he just another corpse waiting for the Administratum to file the paperwork? The inquisitorial fortress on Cardia's moon was a place where nightmares went to be catalogued. Its vaults contained xenotech that could unmake stars, prescribed texts that drove readers mad, and samples of diseases that had killed entire sectors. In Chamber 13, Inquisitor Craven stood before a hololithic display showing Magneto's arrival on repeat, watching the compression of Imperial steel with the detached fascination of a surgeon examining a tumor. His servo skull hovered beside him, scratching notes onto vellum, with a quill dipped in gene-coded ink. "No warp signature," Craven muttered, tapping the display where Magneto's electromagnetic field should have registered as psychic activity. "No demonic taint. No xenotech implants, just magnetism, localized reality manipulation without touching the immaterium." He leaned closer, his augmetic eye whirring as it magnified the image. Impossible, and yet. Behind him, Magos datasmith Ven 9 of the Adeptus Mechanicus watched with 17 additional sensory organs, each one processing the data through a different analytical filter. The Magos had replaced 70% of his biological matter with blessed machinery over 2 centuries of service, and his remaining organic brain was barely more than a support system for his cognitive engines. When he spoke, his voice was a chorus of overlapping frequencies, some audible, some transmitted directly via noospheric link. This organism demonstrates STC-level manipulation of fundamental electromagnetic forces. Classification: potential archaeotech recovery priority. Recommendation: capture for dissection and reverse engineering. The Omnissiah's knowledge must be reclaimed. Ven 9's mechadendrites twitched with barely contained excitement, their tips crackling with data hunger. To the Mechanicus, Magneto wasn't a threat, he was a puzzle. And puzzles existed to be so. Loved peace by screaming peace. Craven waved a dismissive hand, his attention still locked on the display. "Your Forge World can file a requisition like everyone else, Magos. Right now, this entity is Ordo Xenos jurisdiction until proven otherwise." He cycled through additional feeds, showing Magneto walking through the Cadian refugee camps that had sprung up in the wake of the planet's destruction. Civilians scattered before him. PDF troopers aimed lasguns with shaking hands but didn't fire. A child, no more than 6, stared at him with the hollow eyes of someone who had seen too much horror to register one more monster. Magneto knelt before the child, extended his hand, and a twisted piece of scrap metal reformed into a crude toy soldier. The child took it, didn't smile, just clutched it and ran. Kraven froze the image. He's trying to win hearts and minds, classic insurgent tactics, showing mercy, building trust. That makes him more dangerous than a chaos incursion. The third figure in the chamber had remained silent until now. Brother Captain Alaric of the Grey Knights stood in full Terminator armor, a walking fortress inscribed with wards that made reality itself uncomfortable in his presence. His psychic hood crackled with low-level power, and his force halberd thrummed with barely restrained violence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I have walked through the Garden of Nurgle and returned unsoiled. I have spoken the true name of a greater demon and watched it unravel. This, mutant, registers as psychically null, not blank, not pariah, null, as if the warp refuses to acknowledge his existence." Alaric's helmet turned toward the hologram, and even through the ceramite, Kraven could feel the intensity of his gaze. That should not be possible. Everything that lives touches the warp. Everything, except him. Kraven nodded slowly, his mind already racing through classifications and protocols. In the Imperium, everything had a designation. Psychers were rated on the assignment scale from Rho to Alpha, with Alpha Plus reserved for beings who could crack planets. Xenos were categorized by threat level and exploitability. Chaos corruption had 17 distinct stages, each with specific quarantine and purgation requirements. But Magneto fit none of these categories. He manipulated reality without warp touch. He demonstrated power exceeding most alpha-level psychers without registering on any psychic monitoring equipment. He was human in form, but impossible in function. "We need a new classification," Kraven said finally, turning to his servo skull. "Designation: Omega level non-psyker anomaly. Threat assessment: Keter maximal. Recommended response: contain or terminate. No exceptions." Ven 9's mechadendrites drooped in what might have been disappointment. Termination would waste invaluable data. This organism's neural architecture may hold the key to non-warp reality manipulation. The implications for Mechanicus augmentation protocols alone. Kraven cut him off with a sharp gesture. "The implications don't matter if he destabilizes 3 sectors before you can dissect him, Magos. This isn't a laboratory specimen, this is a walking extinction event who thinks he's a liberator." He pulled up another feed, this one showing Magneto addressing a crowd of hive workers on one of Cadia's remaining industrial platforms. The workers listened, transfixed, as he spoke of freedom from oppression, of dignity for the masses, of a future where humanity wasn't crushed beneath the boot of uncaring authority. Half of them were weeping. A quarter looked ready to follow him into the eye of terror itself. The rest just looked confused, as if the concept of hope was a language they'd forgotten how to speak. "He's offering them exactly what the Imperium can't," Kraven continued, his voice grim. "Choice, agency, the illusion that their suffering matters. In 3 days he's become a folk hero to half the surviving Cadian population. In 3 weeks we'll have riots. In 3 months, a full-scale insurrection." He closed the feed and turned to face both Alaric and Ven 9 directly. "The Imperium runs on despair. Our citizens endure because they believe there's no alternative. They work themselves to death in the factorums because they think it's the only way humanity survives. They send their children to die in the guard because the commissars tell them it's glorious. But this mutant, he's telling them they deserve better. And that's a virus more dangerous than anything Nurgle ever cooked up." Kraven's augmetic eye flickered red. "Ideas kill empires. Hope kills compliance. And this man is selling both." Alaric's force halberd pulsed once, a slow heartbeat of psychic energy. "Then we kill him before the infection spreads. The Grey Knights have purged entire worlds for less." But even as he said it, something in his voice suggested doubt. Not moral doubt. Grey Knights were psycho-indoctrinated past such weakness, but tactical doubt. The kind that came from recognizing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded standard threat models. Magneto had stopped an entire regiment's worth of metal with a gesture. He'd compressed a battalion's arsenal into a singularity without breaking a sweat. And according to every scan they'd run, He'd done it while generating less psychic energy than a sleeping guardsman's dreams. If they sent standard kill teams, they'd just be feeding him more metal to weaponize. If they deployed Titans, he'd have even bigger weapons to turn against them. The Grey Knights were humanity's ultimate weapon against chaos. But Magneto wasn't chaos. He was something else entirely, something new. Craven pulled up a final image, a schematic of a Grey Knight strike cruiser's armory, psi cannons, force weapons, sanctified ammunition, storm bolters loaded with rounds blessed by the Emperor himself. All of it was metal, every last piece. "Brother Captain," Craven said quietly, "when you deploy against this target, you'll be fighting him with the very thing he controls. Your armor, your weapons, your ship, all of it is a potential weapon in his hands." Alaric didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried the cold certainty of a man who had faced impossible odds before and triumphed through sheer faith and violence. "Then we'll strip down to our robes and beat him to death with our hands if we must. The Emperor protects Inquisitor, and the Emperor does not tolerate threats to his Imperium." The Force halberd's pulse quickened, matching Alaric's rising battle fury. Somewhere in the warp, demons felt that fury and shuddered. But Magneto wasn't in the warp. He was standing on solid ground, surrounded by metal, in a galaxy built on metal, and he had no idea what was coming for him. The Imperial Guard didn't send negotiators. They sent the 23rd Krieg Death Corps, and that told Magneto everything he needed to know about how this conversation would end. They arrived at dawn, marching through the ash fields in perfect formation, gas masks reflecting the pale sun like 1,000 blank faces staring into eternity. No banners, no war cries, just the rhythmic crunch of boots on dead soil and the mechanical hiss of rebreather units cycling recycled air. Magneto watched them approach from atop a ruined basilica, his cape snapping in the wind, and felt a familiar disgust rising in his chest. These weren't soldiers. They were slaves in uniform, so indoctrinated that they'd march into a meat grinder singing hymns to their own extinction. He'd seen it before in a dozen different worlds, 100 different armies, humanity's endless capacity to turn its own children into ammunition. The Krieg stopped 300 meters out, formed firing lines with mechanical precision, and waited. They didn't demand surrender. They just raised their lasguns and prepared to execute. The first volley never reached him. 3,000 bolts streaked across the wasteland in a wall of coherent light, and Magneto simply raised his hand. The beams bent, curved, refracted through the electromagnetic field surrounding him like light through a prism, scattering harmlessly into the sky in a cascade of crimson starbursts. The Krieg reloaded and fired again. Same result. Third volley, fourth, fifth. They kept firing with the relentless patience of machines, and Magneto let them waste their ammunition because he needed them to understand something fundamental. Their weapons were children's toys, and he was done playing with children. When the volley finally stopped, the silence was absolute. Magneto descended from the basilica in a slow, deliberate float, and every Krieg trooper tracked him with their weapons, but nobody fired. They were waiting for orders, always waiting for orders, never thinking, never questioning, just following commands until someone told them to die. "I didn't come here to kill you," Magneto called out, his voice carrying across the gap between them with unnatural clarity. "I came here because I've spent my life watching systems like yours grind people into dust. You're not soldiers, you're victims, slaves in all but name, dying for an empire that sees you as expendable ammunition." He gestured toward the nearest Krieg trooper, a corporal by the insignia on his greatcoat. "How old are you? 20? 25? How many of your brothers died before you were old enough to hold a rifle? How many will die after you're gone, feeding the same endless war machine?" The corporal didn't respond, didn't even move. Behind the gas mask, there might have been nothing at all, just programming wearing human skin. Magneto's fist clenched, and every lasgun in the Krieg formation twisted 30 degrees to the left, barrels bending like wilted flowers. "I'm offering you a choice. Walk away, go home, stop dying for people who wouldn't piss on you if you were burning, or stay and learn what happens when you point weapons at someone who's done with being threatened." The response came not from the Krieg, but from the sky. A Valkyrie gunship screamed overhead, its twin heavy bolters tracking Magneto's position with mechanical precision. Then 3 more, then a squadron. Within seconds, the air was thick with Imperial aircraft, each one a flying weapons platform loaded with enough firepower to level a city block. Magneto looked up, calculated angles and vectors, felt the electromagnetic signature of every engine, every weapon system, every targeting cogitator. All of it was metal. All of it was his. The lead Valkyrie opened fire, heavy bolter rounds the size of his fist tearing through the air in a storm of mass-reactive death. Magneto stopped them, all of them, mid-flight, hundreds of rounds frozen in a sphere around him like insects tree, apt in amber, each one spinning slowly, catching the light. He could feel the pilot's confusion through the aircraft systems, sense the gunners frantically cycling their weapons as nothing happened. Nothing except Magneto reaching out with his power and crushing every gun barrel into twisted scrap. The Valkyries scattered, pilots recognizing a no-win scenario when they saw one, but Magneto wasn't done teaching. He reached up with both hands and pulled, and 3 of the gunships simply fell out of the sky, not shot down, not exploded, just yanked earthward by an invisible hand, ripping their metal frames apart from the inside. Engines seized, control surfaces locked, hydraulics burst. The pilots screamed into their Vox units as their aircraft became coffins, and Magneto held them there, 30 meters above the ground, letting them feel the helplessness he'd felt 1,000 times before. Held at gunpoint, locked in cells, hunted by people who feared what they couldn't control. But he didn't let them crash. At the last second he set them down, hard enough to crumple landing gear, gentle enough that nobody died. The hatches popped open and pilots stumbled out, shaking, staring at him like he was a demon made flesh, and maybe to them, he was. The Krieg opened fire again, all of them at once, 3,000 last bolts followed by frag grenades, crack grenades, plasma charges, anything they had that might kill him. It was suicide. They knew it was suicide. But Kriegers were born in test tubes and raised in barracks where the only lesson was obedience unto death, and if command said attack, they attacked until either the enemy died or they did. Magneto felt a flash of genuine rage, not at the soldiers themselves, they were victims, but at the system that had lobotomized them so thoroughly they couldn't recognize liberation when it was offered. He swept his arm in a wide arc, and every weapon in the Krieg formation tore itself from their hands, floating up into the sky in a rising cloud of metal. Grenades detonated harmlessly in midair. Plasma cells vented their energy into nothing. 3,000 guardsmen stood disarmed, defenseless, and Magneto floated above them like a dark angel passing judgment. "Go home," he said again, quieter now, almost pleading. "Please, just go home." They didn't. A commissar stepped forward from the rear ranks, bolt pistol raised, and Magneto felt the familiar spike of fury that always came when he met the architects of oppression face to face. This was the man who shot soldiers for retreating, who executed guardsmen for showing fear, who maintained discipline through terror and called it leadership. The commissar aimed carefully, his finger tightening on the trigger, and Magneto was about to teach him what happened to tyrants when a new sound cut through the battlefield, a sound like reality tearing, like angels screaming, like the warp itself recoiling in fear, and then they arrived, the Grey Knights, 5 of them, teleporting directly into the combat zone in a flash of silver light and psychic fire, their armor inscribed with wards so potent that Magneto's electromagnetic field flickered just from proximity. Brother Captain Alaric stood at their center, force halberd blazing with power that made the air itself burn, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Magneto of Terror, you are classified as an Omega-level threat to the Imperium of Man. Surrender now or be destroyed." The other Grey Knights raised their storm bolters, and Magneto realized with cold certainty that he was looking at weapons that didn't care about magnetism. Psychic weapons, blessed rounds, sanctified death. This was different. This was real. Magneto dropped to the ground, boots hitting scorched earth, and the battlefield held its breath. The Krieg watched. The pilots watched. The commissar watched. And in orbit above, Inquisitor Craven watched through a dozen pict feeds, his finger hovering over the button that would call down an orbital strike if this went wrong. Magneto looked at the Grey Knights, at their psychic fury and absolute faith, and saw his own death reflected in their armor, He'd faced gods before, fought Apocalypse, Onslaught, the Phoenix Force itself, but those fights had rules. Physics he understood, powers he could counter. This was something else. This was faith made manifest, belief weaponized, conviction turned into a force that could crack reality itself. And for the first time since arriving in this insane universe, Eric Lenscher, survivor of the Holocaust, master of magnetism, liberator of mutant kind, felt genuinely afraid, not of death. He'd made peace with mortality decades ago, but afraid that he'd finally found a world where his power meant nothing, where being right didn't matter, where liberation was just another word for heresy, and heresy in the Imperium had only one punishment. The Grey Knights didn't waste time with speeches or ultimatums beyond Alaric's initial challenge. They simply attacked, moving with the coordinated precision of warriors who had fought together across centuries and battlefields that would shatter mortal minds. Brother Castian opened fire first, his Stormbolter spitting psychically charged rounds that burned the air like falling stars. Magneto raised his hand to deflect them and felt his electromagnetic field strain against something it couldn't fully grasp. The bolts were metal, yes, but they were also wrapped in psychic energy so dense it had weight, momentum, purpose beyond physics. He managed to deflect 3. The 4th grazed his shoulder, and where it touched, his uniform burned with silver fire. Pain exploded through him, not just physical, but spiritual, as if the round had carved away a piece of his soul. He gasped, stumbled back, and realized with mounting horror that these warriors were fighting him on 2 levels simultaneously: metal and mind, matter and faith. And faith, he was learning, could punch through magnetism like paper. Brother Castian pressed forward, firing in controlled bursts, while brothers Raymer and Drusus flanked left and right, their force swords blazing with psychic fire. Magneto reached out with his power, trying to seize their armor, crush their weapons, anything to gain advantage. He found purchase on Drusus's pauldron and twisted, and the ceramite cracked with a sound like breaking bone. But before he could follow through, Alaric was there, force halberd swinging in an arc that left afterimages burned into reality. Magneto threw up a magnetic shield, compressing the iron in the soil into a barrier 3 meters thick. The halberd cut through it like it wasn't there. Magneto dove aside, the blade missing his head by centimeters, and he felt the psychic backwash of its passing, a sensati. Unlike standing too close to a star, all heat and pressure and annihilating light. These weren't just warriors. They were living weapons forged from faith and fury, and every swing carried the weight of 10,000 years of human survival. He needed space, distance, time to think. Magneto launched himself skyward, pulling iron from deep underground to create a platform beneath his feet, rising fast above the battlefield. Below, the Krieg watched in silence, their gas masks reflecting the morning sun like death masks at a funeral. The Grey Knights didn't pursue skyward, they didn't need to. Brother Raymer simply raised his Stormbolter and fired a single round, and Magneto felt something impossible happen. The bolt accelerated, not naturally, not following ballistic physics. It accelerated because Raymer willed it to, because his faith bent reality into a shape where the round could not miss, would not miss, must not miss. Magneto caught it with his power, held it frozen 3 meters from his chest, and the effort made blood vessels burst in his eyes. The round fought him, actually fought him, like it was alive, like it wanted to kill him with the same fervent devotion the Grey Knights themselves possessed. He crushed it finally, compacted it into a marble of twisted metal, and let it drop. His hands were shaking. "You fight well for a heretic," Alaric called up from below, his voice carrying impossible distance. "But you fight alone. We fight with the Emperor's blessing, with 10 millennia of accumulated faith, with the psychic might of 1,000,000 martyred souls standing at our backs." He planted his force halberd in the ground, and the earth itself seemed to genuflect around him, cracks spreading outward in geometric patterns that looked almost like prayers written in stone. "You are one man, powerful, yes, unique, certainly, but still just one man facing the collective will of humanity's greatest warriors. How long can you endure?" It wasn't a taunt. It was a genuine question asked with the clinical curiosity of a scientist documenting an experiment. How long could Magneto's body sustain this level of electromagnetic manipulation? How long before exhaustion set in, before his concentration slipped? before the Grey Knight's sanctified rounds found their mark. Alaric had fought greater demons who could reshape continents. Magneto was formidable, but he was also mortal, and mortals broke. Magneto's answer came not in words, but in action. He reached out with his power and seized every piece of metal within a kilometer, not just weapons, everything. The metal frames of ruined buildings, rebar buried in rubble, shell casings scattered across decades of warfare, the iron in the soil itself, dragged up from geological layers that hadn't seen sunlight in millennia. It all rose, tons of it, hundreds of tons, a floating storm of scrap and shrapnel and twisted wreckage orbiting him like planets around a dying star. The Krieg scattered, finally breaking formation as chunks of debris the size of chimeras began raining down around them. The Grey Knights held their ground, storm shields raised, sanctified armor weathering impacts that would have pulverized standard Astartes. And Magneto, standing at the eye of his metal hurricane, felt power surge through him like electricity through copper wire. This was his element, his domain. He'd moved satellites, manipulated planetary magnetic fields, held the iron in a man's blood and stopped his heart from across a room. These warriors were dangerous, yes, but they were also wrapped head to toe in metal. He struck, not with finesse, not with precision, with overwhelming force. Every piece of debris in his storm compressed inward simultaneously, converging on the Grey Knights from 1,000 angles at once, moving faster than sound, faster than thought. The impact should have been extinction level, should have crushed ceramite and bone into a red smear on dead earth, but the Grey Knights were ready. Brother Castian slammed his gauntlet into the ground, and a psychic barrier erupted around the squad, a hemisphere of translucent energy inscribed with litanies of protection so ancient they predated the Imperium itself. Magneto's attack hit the barrier and stopped. Tons of metal suspended against a wall of pure faith, and for a moment the two forces were perfectly balanced. Matter versus mind, physics versus belief. Magneto pushed harder, pouring more power into the assault, and the barrier cracked. Hairline fractures spread across its surface like a windshield under pressure. The Grey Knights inside braced themselves, preparing for breakthrough. And then Alaric spoke a single word in a language that hadn't existed since before humanity crawled out of caves and the barrier exploded outward. The shockwave caught Magneto mid-concentration and hurled him backward like a leaf in a storm. He tumbled through the air, losing altitude, losing control, the debris storm scattering as his focus shattered. He hit the ground hard enough to crack stone, rolled, came up on one knee gasping for breath. Blood ran from his nose, his ribs screamed protest. When he looked up, the Grey Knights were advancing, walking through the settling dust like angels of death come to collect a soul. They hadn't even scratched their armor, hadn't slowed their pace, hadn't shown the slightest sign of concern. And Magneto realized with crystalline clarity that this wasn't a fight he could win through power alone. They'd tanked his best shot and walked through it singing hymns. These warriors had fought things that made him look like a street magician with parlor tricks, and they'd won every single time because they fought with something he didn't have. They fought with faith, unshakable, absolute reality-warping faith. And faith, in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Alaric stopped 10 meters away, Force halberd resting against his shoulder, and for a moment there was almost respect in his voice. You could have been a great servant of the Imperium, mutant. That power, properly directed, could have saved worlds. But you chose to spread dissent, to offer false hope, to suggest that humanity deserves better than survival. He shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying centuries of accumulated sorrow. There is no better. There is only the Emperor's light, and the darkness trying to extinguish it. You don't understand what's waiting in that darkness. What we fight every day to keep at bay. The things that would eat your soul and use your corpse as a puppet. The gods of chaos who promise freedom and deliver only damnation. The Xenos horrors who see humanity as cattle or slaves or tumors to be excised. This Imperium, this cruel, grinding, merciless Imperium, is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. He raised his halberd. So we cannot allow you to weaken it. Not for mercy, not for justice, not even for truth. Only survival matters now. The Grey Knights moved to execute judgment, and Magneto prepared to fight to his last breath. But before either side could act, reality screamed, not metaphorically, literally. The air itself split open with a sound like bones breaking, and something impossibly wrong reached through the tear from a place that shouldn't exist. A chaos rift. Small, barely 3 meters across, but through it poured creatures that made Magneto's blood freeze in his veins. Demons. Things of pure malice and hunger, their forms shifting and writhing, existing partially in real space and partially in dimensions that physics couldn't accommodate. The Grey Knights pivoted instantly, their attention shifting from Magneto to the rift with the speed of long practice. This was their purpose, their calling, the reason they existed. And as Alaric charged toward the breach, he spared Magneto one final glance. "We will finish this later, mutant. But if you have any wisdom at all, you'll run, because what comes through that rift is what happens when the Imperium falls, and you don't want to see it hungry." Then the Grey Knights were gone, plunging into a battle against nightmares made flesh, and Magneto was left standing alone on a battlefield that had suddenly become far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Magneto had seen horrors in his lifetime. He'd watched families torn apart in concentration camps, seen mutant children hunted like animals, witnessed humanity's capacity for cruelty distilled into policy and law. But the things pouring through that rift were something else entirely. They weren't creatures, they were concepts given flesh, hate with teeth, hunger with claws, madness wearing skin like an ill-fitting coat. A bloodletter manifested first, its brass armor weeping molten metal, its hellblade burning with fire that consumed light itself. It shrieked in a voice that bypassed ears and carved directly into the brain, and 3 Krieg troopers simply dropped dead from the sound alone, blood pouring from their eyes and nose. The demon charged toward the nearest group of guardsmen, and Magneto acted on instinct. He reached out with his power, seized the creature's brass armor, and tried to stop it. The armor responded. The demon didn't. It kept running, the metal bending and warping around its body like water, and Magneto realized with mounting dread that he was manipulating the container, but the thing inside didn't obey physics. More demons followed, pink horrors tumbling through the rift like cancerous gymnasts, their laughter a sound that made sanity negotiable. Plague bearers shambling forward, dragging diseases that could kill planets, their flesh sloughing off with each step only to regenerate in new and more impossible configurations. And behind them all, barely visible through the tear in reality, something vast and terrible watched with eyes that had never known mercy. The Grey Knights hit the demon tide like a psychic tsunami. Brother Castian's Stormbolter roared, each bolt exploding with cleansing fire that burned warp stuff back to nothing. Brothers Raymer and Drusus carved through plague bearers with their force swords, the blades singing hymns of destruction that made the demons scream in languages that predated sound. And Alaric stood at the center of it all, his force halberd a beacon of silver light, each swing banishing horrors back to the warp with the absolute authority of the Emperor's chosen. They were magnificent, terrifying and magnificent. Warriors fighting a war that had no end, only endless variations of the same apocalypse. But they were also 5 warriors against a tide of nightmares, and the rift was growing. Magneto watched a pink horror explode into 2 blue horrors, which immediately attacked a Krieg squad with warp fire that melted flesh and boiled blood inside veins. He watched a bloodletter bisect a guardsman from shoulder to hip, the demon's blade passing through flak armor like it was paper. He watched reality itself buckle under the pressure of the immaterium bleeding through, saw the ground crack and weep blood that had never belonged to any living thing. And he made a decision. Not because he suddenly believed in the Imperium, not because he trusted the Grey Knights, but because whatever these things were, they were extinction with teeth. And extinction didn't negotiate, it just consumed. Magneto rose into the air, arms spread wide, and reached out with his power toward the rift itself. If it was a tear in reality, then reality had structure, had framework, had metal somewhere in its composition. He found it in the most unexpected place. The warp rift wasn't just a hole, it was being held open by something mechanical, ancient, a fragment of archaeotech buried in Cadia's crust, damaged during the Tortuoto. planet's destruction, now bleeding chaos energy like a wound that couldn't close. Magneto couldn't see it directly, but he could feel it through his power, sense the twisted metal components still functioning deep underground, despite being warped by warp exposure into configurations that shouldn't exist. He reached down through kilometers of broken stone, past layers of dead earth and fossilized horror, and found the device. It fought him, not consciously, but it had been touched by chaos long enough that it resisted order, resisted structure, resisted anything that wasn't entropy and madness. Magneto gritted his teeth and pulled. Not gently, he ripped the entire mechanism out of the ground in a shower of rock and magma, dragging it up through Cadia's crust like extracting a tumor, and the rift immediately began to destabilize. The effect was instantaneous. Demons mid-charge suddenly flickered, their forms becoming translucent, less real. The pink horror's laughter turned to screams of fury as they felt their connection to the material realm weakening. A plague-bearer tried to infect a guardsman and simply passed through him like smoke, its claws finding no purchase in reality. Alaric noticed immediately, his head snapping toward Magneto with what might have been surprise behind that emotionless helmet. "He's closing the rift," Brother Castian voxed, his voice carrying disbelief despite the psychic conditioning that should have stripped such emotions away. "The mutant is actively fighting the warp incursion." Alaric said nothing, but his force halberd blazed brighter, and the Grey Knights redoubled their assault. They had to banish every demon before the rift closed completely, or the creatures would be trapped in real space, able to cause untold damage before finally dissipating. This was a race against metaphysics itself, and Magneto had just changed the rules. Archaeotech device hung suspended in the air above the battlefield, a mass of twisted metal and crystalline components that hurt to look at directly. Magneto could feel chaos energy radiating from it like poison, could sense how prolonged exposure to the warp had transformed its structure into something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Touching it with his power felt like grabbing live wire, each contact sending feedback through his nervous system that tasted like copper and madness. But he held on, compressed it, began crushing the device inward, collapsing its multi-dimensional structure back into three-dimensional space by sheer force of will. The rift screamed, actually screamed, reality itself protesting as the wound was cauterized. Demons began dissolving faster now, their forms unraveling like burning paper, pink horrors winking out mid-cackle, plague-bearers collapsing into puddles of warp stuff that evaporated into nothing. The bloodletter Alaric had been dueling looked down at its fading hands, then up at Magneto with eyes full of infinite rage and something that might have been respect, before it dissolved into vapor and memory. The last demon died screaming Magneto's true name in a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, a parting curse that made his skull feel like it was splitting open. Then silence. The rift sealed with a sound like a book slamming shut, and the Archaeotech device crumbled to dust in Magneto's grip, finally destroyed beyond any possibility of function. He floated there, breathing hard, blood running from his ears where the warp feedback had caused hemorrhaging. Below, the battlefield was a charnel house, 50 Krieg dead or dying, their bodies corrupted by warp touch beyond any hope of recovery. Civilians who'd watched from the refugee camps now catatonic, their minds unable to process what they'd witnessed. And in the center of it all, the Grey Knights stood unmarked, their armor still gleaming silver, their weapons still humming with power. They looked at Magneto. He looked back, and for a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Two sides of a conflict neither wanted but both understood was inevitable, just delayed, postponed until the greater threat was handled. Alaric broke the silence first, deactivating his force halberd but not sheathing it. "You fought against the warp." It wasn't a question, just a statement of observed fact, delivered with the same clinical detachment he might use to describe weather patterns. "You closed a chaos rift, saved Imperial lives, acted in defense of humanity against its truest enemy." He paused, helmet turning slightly as if consulting with his battle brothers through some internal vox. "This does not absolve your crimes, does not change your classification as an Omega-level threat. does not mean the Imperium will suddenly trust you or grant you clemency. His force halberd pointed directly at Magneto's chest. But it does mean you get one chance, one opportunity to walk away, return to wherever you came from, leave this galaxy, to fight its own wars, because the next time we meet, mutant, I will not hesitate. The Emperor's mercy has limits, and you have just exhausted yours. Magneto descended slowly, boots touching scorched earth, and looked at Alaric with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. I closed that rift because letting those things win serves nobody. Not you, not your Imperium, not the people you claim to protect. He gestured toward the Krieg survivors who were already reforming ranks, already preparing to resume their eternal war despite having just watched reality vomit nightmares into their laps. But don't mistake pragmatism for surrender. I've spent my life fighting oppression, and your Imperium is oppression on a galactic scale. You grind billions into paste and call it necessity. You lobotomize children and call it duty. You exterminate entire worlds and call it mercy. His fists clenched, metal debris around him beginning to tremble. So no, I won't walk away. I won't abandon these people to your meat grinder. But I will be more careful, more strategic, because you've taught me something important today, Captain Alaric. He met the Grey Knight's gaze with absolute certainty. This universe runs on faith and horror in equal measure, and if I'm going to change it, I need to understand both. The Grey Knights could have attacked then, should have, by any reasonable tactical assessment, but Alaric simply stood there, studying Magneto with the intensity of a man cataloging something that might someday kill him. Then he turned away, his squad falling in behind him, and spoke one final time over his shoulder. Faith and horror, mutant. You're right about that much, but you're wrong about which one matters more. He activated his teleport Homer, silver light beginning to coalesce around the Grey Knights. Faith sustains, horror simply destroys, and in the end, when the galaxy finally burns, only faith will remain standing in the ashes. The light flared. The Grey Knights vanished, and Magneto was left alone on a battlefield scattered with bodies and questions he didn't know how to answer. He'd won, sort of, survived, barely, but the real fight, he was beginning to understand, hadn't even started yet. The Imperium had just shown him how deep the rabbit hole went, and somewhere in orbit above, Inquisitor Kraven was already writing new orders, new protocols, new plans to deal with an Omega-level threat who refused to die. The hunt had just begun. 3 days after the Grey Knights withdrew, Magneto woke to find his makeshift shelter surrounded by Skitarii, not attacking, just standing there in perfect silence, their augmetic eyes glowing red in the pre-dawn darkness, their radium carbines held at parade rest. 50 of them, maybe more. It was hard to count when half their bodies were replaced with machinery that seemed to shift and reconfigure as he watched, legs becoming tripods, arms splitting into additional manipulator limbs, heads crowned with sensor arrays that tracked his every micro-movement. They'd arrived without sound, which should have been impossible for beings composed largely of metal. But the Adeptus Mechanicus had been manipulating metal for 10 thousand years, and they knew tricks Magneto had never imagined. At the center of the formation stood Margot's Data-Smith Ven 9, his robes crackling with static electricity, his mechadendrites writhing like serpents tasting the air. When he spoke, his voice was a symphony of overlapping frequencies, some human, most decidedly not. Magneto, designation unknown. You are requested for immediate consultation regarding Incident Cadia 77 Omega. Compliance is optimal. Magneto rose slowly, his magnetic field instinctively flaring to life, and immediately felt something wrong. The Skitarii's weapons weren't responding, not refusing to respond, that he could fight, but simply not registering as metal within his sphere of influence. He focused harder, pushing his power outward, and felt his consciousness slide off their equipment like oil on water. Ven 9's mechanical laughter sounded like gears grinding inside a broken clock. Nullfield generators, mutant entity. Localized reality stabilization preventing electromagnetic manipulation within 15-meter radius. Your power signature has been analyzed, quantified, and countered. A mechadendrite extended, its tip displaying a hololithic projection of Magneto's fight with the Grey Knights, every gesture catalogued, every electromagnetic pulse measured and graphed. The Omnissiah provides understanding. Understanding provides control. You are understood. Therefore, you are controlled. Please accompany designated units to Forge World Metallica orbital platform. Refusal will result in neural incapacitation via directed electromagnetic pulse specifically calibrated to your biological neural architecture. It was the most polite threat Magneto had ever received, delivered with the clinical detachment of a surgeon explaining an amputation. He could fight, could try to push through the null field, draw metal from further away, maybe collapse the shelter on top of them and escape in the chaos. But the Skitarii weren't positioned for combat. They were positioned for capture, and their weapons, whatever they were, stayed trained on him with the precision of computer-guided targeting. More importantly, Ven 9 wasn't treating him like a threat. He was treating him like a specimen, a puzzle to be solved, and Magneto had learned long ago that sometimes you learned more by playing along than by fighting. "I'll come," he said finally, keeping his hands visible, his power restrained. "But I'm not your prisoner, Magos. I'm not your experiment, and if you try to dissect me like one of your relics, you'll learn exactly how much damage I can do before your null fields finish warming up." The journey to orbit was surreal. The Mechanicus shuttle was more machine than spacecraft, its interior a forest of cables and cogitators that pulsed with binaric cant like a mechanical heartbeat. The Skitarii stood motionless during the entire ascent, not speaking, barely breathing, just existing in that uncanny space between human and machine. Ven 9, however, wouldn't shut up. He narrated the entire trip in a stream of consciousness that was part technical analysis, part religious sermon, part genuine enthusiasm. "Your electromagnetic manipulation represents potential recovery of lost standard template construct knowledge. Hypothesis: you are descended from Dark Age humanity. Genetic modification branch designation unknown. Alternative hypothesis: warp exposure resulted in stable mutation, allowing reality manipulation without psychic signature. Tertiary hypothesis: you are an archaeotech construct of sufficient sophistication to mimic biological function. The Magos leaned closer, his augmetic eyes dilating and contracting independently. Which hypothesis excites you most? Mutant entity? I personally favor tertiary, the elegance of a machine believing itself flesh. The poetry of it stimulates my emotional cortex remnants. Forge World Metallica's orbital platform was visible through the viewport, and Magneto felt his breath catch despite himself. It wasn't a space station, it was a city, a nation, an entire civilization compressed into a construct the size of a small moon, its surface covered in forge temples that burned with plasma fires hot enough to birth stars. Starships in various states of construction hung in massive dry docks, some barely skeletons of steel, others nearly complete leviathans capable of carrying 10,000 souls into the void. And everywhere was metal, billions of tons of it, iron and steel and alloys that didn't exist in any periodic table Magneto had ever studied. He could feel it all calling to him, could sense the electromagnetic potential, like standing before an ocean and knowing you could command every wave. This was power, real power. More metal in one place than he'd manipulated in his entire life combined, and the Mechanicus had brought him here, surrounded by null fields, helpless. It was either incredible stupidity or terrifying confidence. The shuttle docked at a forge temple designated Manufactorum Primus Alpha, and Magneto was escorted through corridors that looked like the interior of a giant machine digesting itself and being reborn simultaneously. Tech priests shuffled past, some barely human anymore, others so augmented they were mobile cathedrals of blessed machinery. Servitors, human bodies lobotomized and rebuilt as organic robots, performed repetitive tasks with dead eyes and mechanical precision. Magneto felt rage building in his chest. This was what the Imperium did to people, stripped away consciousness, agency, identity, and called it sacred service. These weren't workers, they were slaves who couldn't even comprehend their own slavery, programmed at the neurological level to worship the chains that bound them. Ven 9 noticed his expression and tilted his head in what might have been curiosity. You experience negative emotional response to servitor population, inefficient reaction. Servitors are criminals, vat-grown clones, or willing supplicants seeking immortality through service. They achieve purpose, function, meaning. What more could flesh desire? They arrived at a chamber that defied description. It was part laboratory, part cathedral, part something that existed in dimensions Magneto's brain struggled to process. Machinery covered every surface, but it was machinery that seemed alive, breathing, thinking, dreaming mechanical dreams. In the center of it all stood an examination platform surrounded by devices Magneto couldn't begin to identify. Neural scanners, genetic sequencers, devices that looked like they measured things that shouldn't be measurable. Then Nine gestured toward the platform with a mechadendrite. Please position yourself for analysis. Process will take approximately 4 hours. Involves complete genetic mapping, neural architecture documentation, electromagnetic field, harmonics cataloging, and theological classification. The Magos paused, then added with what might have been meant as reassurance. Procedure is minimally invasive. Estimated survival probability, 73%. Acceptable margins for knowledge acquisition of this magnitude. Magneto didn't move toward the platform. Instead, he turned to face Ven 9 directly, his voice cold with barely controlled fury. Let me make something absolutely clear, Magos. I'm not stepping onto that platform. I'm not becoming another data point in your archives. And if you think your null fields make me helpless, you're about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating someone who's spent decades fighting people who thought they had me contained. He could feel the null field pressing against his power, could sense its limits, its boundaries. It was strong, but it wasn't perfect. Nothing made by human hands ever was. And Magneto had made a career out of finding the flaws in humanity's cages. He reached out with his power, not toward the Skitarii, not toward the obvious metal, but toward the platform itself, found the microscopic imperfections in its construction, the stress fractures, the weak points, and began to push. The platform groaned, then shrieked, metal tearing against metal as Magneto forced its components to move in ways they weren't designed to move. The Skitarii raised their weapons immediately, but Ven 9 raised a hand, stopping them. The Magos stared at Magneto with an expression that might have been fury or might have been religious ecstasy. It was hard to tell with someone who'd replaced most of his face with sensors. You damage sacred machinery, blasphemy of highest order, and yet, he moved closer, his augmetic eyes recording every micro-movement of Magneto's power. You manipulate metal from within null field effective radius. Impossible according to current theoretical frameworks. Unless the Magos' remaining organic eye widened. Unless your power operates on quantum level, manipulating fundamental forces below threshold of null field detection. Magnificent, magnificent. His voice rose to a shriek of binary that made the machinery around them resonate in sympathy. You are not mutation, not archaeotech. You are proof of concept. Living evidence that electromagnetic fundamental forces can be consciously controlled at quantum scale. This changes everything. Everything. Before Magneto could respond, alarms screamed throughout the Forge Temple. Not mechanical alarms, psychic ones. Klaxons that bypassed ears and carved directly into the mind, accompanied by Vox announcements in panicked High Gothic. Warp breach detected. Demonic incursion Sector 7 Prime. All combat units respond. Jella field integrity compromised. Corruption spreading. Omnissiah, preserve us, the warp has come. Ven 9's enthusiasm vanished instantly, replaced by cold calculation. He turned to Magneto, and for the first time the Magos sounded almost human, almost afraid. Chaos forces aboard station. Estimated breach, 300 demons minimum, growing exponentially. Station population, 40,000 tech priests, 100,000 servitors. Minimal combat capability. Estimated survival time, 27 minutes before total corruption. He paused, mechadendrites twitching in what might have been a shrug. Your containment is no longer priority concern. Your survival instinct, however, suggests cooperation. Help purge demonic incursion, or die screaming as warp entities feast on your consciousness for eternity. Acceptable terms? Magneto looked at the Magos, at the Skitarii already moving toward the breach, at the Forge Temple shaking as something impossible tore through its blessed halls. He thought about walking away, letting the Mechanicus burn. These were the people who'd enslaved humans and called it enlightenment, who'd threatened to dissect him and called it research. But he also remembered the rift on Cadia, remembered what those demons did to unprotected minds, remembered that whatever else the Imperium was, it stood between humanity and things that made oppression look like mercy. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling onto his shoulders like chains. Turn off your null fields, Magos. You want my help? You get all of it, every ounce of power I have. But after this is over, we're having a very different conversation about consent and cooperation. Understood? Ven 9's mechadendrites twitched in what might have been agreement, or might have been mechanical laughter. Then the null fields dropped, and Magneto felt the full weight of Metallica's metal ocean crash into his consciousness like a tidal wave. Billions of tons, waiting, ready, hungry, and somewhere in the darkness, demons were learning what happened when you invaded a Forge Temple while the Master of Magnetism was visiting. The corridors of Manufactorum Primus Alpha had become abattoirs painted in colors that didn't belong in reality. Magneto followed Ven 9 and his Skitarii deeper into the breach zone, and with each step, the wrongness intensified. Blood ran upward along the walls, defying gravity. Machinery twisted itself into configurations that looked almost like screaming faces. The air tasted like copper and burning hair. And somewhere in the distance, something that might have been laughter or might have been prayers echoed through ventilation shafts that had started breathing. A tech priest stumbled past them, his augmetics sparking and failing, his remaining organic eye weeping blood. He grabbed Magneto's arm with a hand that was more bone than flesh and whispered, "The machine spirits are dying. The Omnissiah has abandoned us. Everything is rust and entropy and the end of function." Then he collapsed, his internal systems shutting down one by one, and Magneto realized with cold horror that the man wasn't dying from wounds. He was dying from despair, from loss of faith so profound his augmetics simply gave up. They found the first demon 3 corridors deeper. It had been human once, maybe, before chaos took it and rebuilt it into something that made biology negotiable. A plague bearer, its flesh a garden of tumors and festering wounds, each one hosting diseases that could end civilizations. It shambled forward with the patient inevitability of entropy itself, and where its feet touched the deck plates, metal corroded and wept rust. Ven 9's Skitarii opened fire immediately, their radium carbines spitting radiation-laced rounds that should have burned through flesh. The plague bearer didn't seem to notice. Holes appeared in its torso, closed with wet sucking sounds, and it kept coming. One Skitarii got too close and the demon simply touched him. Just a brush of fingers against a cis armor. The Skitarii's chassis began to rot, blessed steel turning to brittle rust in seconds, his augmetics failing, his organic components liquefying inside his own armor. He collapsed into a puddle of corruption, and the plague bearer giggled with the voice of a dying child. Magneto had seen enough. He reached out with his power and found the metal in the plague bearer's immediate vicinity. Deck plates, wall supports, piping carrying blessed oils and coolants. He ripped it all free and compressed it around the daemon like a cocoon, tons of steel crushing inward with enough force to atomize stone. The plague bearer burst like an overripe fruit, warp stuff spraying outward in streamers of impossible color before evaporating into nothing. Silence. The Skitarii turned to stare at Magneto with their augmetic eyes, processing, calculating. Ven 9's mechadendrites twitched in what might have been approval. "Effective," the Magos said simply. "Continue." They pushed deeper into the breach zone, and Magneto became a weapon the Mechanicus had never imagined. Every demon they encountered met the same fate: crushed, impaled, bisected by flying shrapnel moving faster than sound. He pulled metal from the Forge Temple's skeleton itself, weaponizing the station against its invaders, and with each kill he felt something shift in the Skitarii's behavior. They stopped treating him like a prisoner, started moving like he was their commander, deferred to his tactical decisions, covered his flanks while he worked. It was subtle, mechanical, but unmistakable. The breach itself was in reactor chamber 7, and the sight of it made Magneto's blood run cold. The entire chamber had been transformed into a gateway, reality stretched thin like membrane, with something vast and terrible pressing against it from the other side. Demons poured through in a steady stream. Bloodletters, horrors, plague-bearers, even a demonette that moved with hypnotic grace and left psychic poison in its wake. And in the center of it all, standing atop the reactor core itself, was something worse. A chaos sorcerer, not possessed, not corrupted, fully aware and completely willing, his flesh inscribed with runes that burned with warp fire, his eyes twin voids that looked directly into Magneto's soul and found it wanting. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing sound to carve directly into consciousness. Ah, the mutant who thinks himself a god, the master of magnetism who believes metal makes him mighty. The sorcerer laughed, and the sound made servitors 3 decks away spontaneously combust. Did you really think the ruinous powers wouldn't notice you? You, who bends reality without touching the warp. You fascinate us, Eric Lenscher. The gods of chaos hunger for souls like yours, powerful, unbroken, deliciously proud. Magneto didn't waste breath on banter. He simply attacked, pulling every piece of metal in the chamber toward the sorcerer in a converging storm of death. The sorcerer raised one hand and the metal stopped, not slowed, stopped, frozen in midair by invisible force, and Magneto felt his controls slip like trying to hold water in his fists. Telekinesis, raw psychic power manipulating matter through will alone, and the sorcerer wielded it with casual contempt. You control metal, little mutant. I control reality. He gestured, and the metal pieces began spinning, forming a whirlwind around Magneto, faster and faster until the air itself ignited from friction. Let me show you the difference between your parlor tricks and true power. The whirlwind compressed inward, and Magneto had to pour everything he had into maintaining a shield, magnetic field against psychic force, physics against metaphysics. The strain was immense. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, his muscles screamed, but he held, barely. And in that moment of stalemate, he understood something crucial. The sorcerer was stronger, more versatile, could manipulate anything, not just metal, but Magneto was focused, specialized, and in his domain, within his element, he was unmatched. He stopped fighting for control of the spinning metal and instead reached past it, down into the Forge Temple's superstructure, into the reactor chamber's foundations. Found the magnetic containment fields keeping the plasma reactor stable. Found the electromagnetic coils that powered half the station. Found every single magnetic system within a kilometer and pulled hard. The effect was catastrophic. Containment fields failed. Plasma vented into cooling systems. Electromagnetic backwash surged through power conduits. The entire chamber became a storm of energized particles and competing magnetic fields, and Magneto stood at the center like a conductor directing an orchestra of chaos. The sorcerer's telekinetic hold shattered as he had to divert attention to protecting himself from the sudden maelstrom. His warp shield flared bright, deflecting superheated plasma, but it left him exposed for a fraction of a second. That was all Magneto needed. He found the iron in the sorcerer's blood, trace amounts, but enough, and pulled. The sorcerer's eyes went wide with shock as his own circulatory system became a weapon. Blood hemorrhaged from every orifice. Vessels burst throughout his brain. He tried to speak a curse, a final damnation, but only Ma naged a wet gurgle before collapsing. The demons shrieked in fury as their anchor to reality died. Without the sorcerer maintaining the breach, the rift began to collapse, sucking warp entities back into the immaterium like water down a drain. They fought it, clawed at the deck plates, tried to drag tech priests with them as final victims. But Magneto wasn't done. He reached out to every demon still in real space and found what he needed. Their forms were warp stuff, yes, but they were manifesting in 3-dimensional space, which meant they had to interact with electromagnetic fields on some level. He couldn't crush them directly, but he could crush everything around them. Walls compressed inward, deck plates folded like origami. The entire breach chamber collapsed into a compacted sphere of twisted metal and dissipating warp energy, and when it was over, the only sound was the groaning of abused superstructure and Ven 9's mechanical breathing. The Magos approached slowly, his augmetic eyes scanning the destruction, his mechadendrites reaching out to touch the crushed metal with what might have been reverence. "You sanctified the Forge Temple through violence," Ven 9 said quietly. "Used its own substance as weapon against chaos. The machine spirits sing of your deed. This is acceptable." Acceptable. Magneto almost laughed. He'd just saved 40,000 lives, destroyed a chaos breach, and killed a sorcerer, and the best the Mechanicus could manage was acceptable. But as he looked around at the Skitarii standing at attention, at the tech priests emerging from hiding to stare at him with something approaching awe, he realized something had shifted. They saw him differently now, not as a specimen, not as a threat, as something useful, something that could be integrated into the Imperium's endless war machine, and that was almost more terrifying than being their enemy, because it meant they'd stop trying to kill him and start trying to recruit him, to shape him, to turn his power into just another weapon in humanity's arsenal of horrors. Ven 9 extended a mechadendrite, the gesture almost formal. "Treaty proposal. You assist Mechanicus research into electromagnetic manipulation. We provide resources, protection, access to Forge Temple facilities, mutual benefit, mutual survival. The Omnissiah teaches that all knowledge serves the machine god, your knowledge included." Magneto looked at the offered mechadendrite, then at the devastation around them, then back at Ven 9's augmetic face. "I'll work with you, Magos. Not for you, not under you, with you, as an equal partner. And in exchange for my help, I want 3 things. He held up fingers, his voice hard as the metal he controlled. "First, no more servitors created from unwilling subjects. No more lobotomizing criminals or VAT slaves. If someone wants to become a servitor, fine, but no more forced conversions. Second, you help me understand this universe. Teach me about the warp, about chaos, about the threats humanity faces. I can't fight what I don't understand. Third, when I'm ready to leave this station, you let me go. No containment, no null fields, no sudden accidents that leave me on an examination table. I help you fight your wars. You respect my autonomy. Those are my terms." Ven 9 was silent for a long moment, his processors calculating probabilities and outcomes at speeds that would shame quantum computers. Finally, his mechadendrites withdrew, and he turned away, already moving toward the exit. "Terms are inefficient, but calculated acceptable given current resource constraints and ongoing chaos threat multiplication." The Magos paused at the doorway, looking back over one shoulder with an expression that was impossible to read behind all the augmetics. "Warning. Inquisitor Craven monitors all station activity. Your display of power has been recorded and transmitted. Classification will escalate. Response will intensify. The Imperium does not forget, mutant entity. It does not forgive. And it does not allow threats to persist indefinitely, regardless of temporary usefulness." Then he was gone, his Skitarii following in perfect formation, and Magneto was left alone in a chamber that smelled like burning metal and warp taint. He'd won again, survived again, proven himself useful to another faction in this nightmare galaxy. But with each victory, he felt the noose tightening. The Imperium was learning about him, studying him, and soon they'd decide whether he was more valuable alive or dead. And Eric Laneshare had learned long ago that in systems built on oppression, useful only lasted until convenient became inconvenient. The question was, how long did he have before the Imperium decided he was too dangerous to tolerate? And what would he do when that moment came? The metal around him hummed with residual energy, and in that humming, Magneto heard something that might have been warning or might have been promise. The galaxy was vast, but it wasn't infinite, and nowhere in all its endless darkness was there a place where power went unopposed forever. Inquisitor Craven watched the picked feed of Magneto's battle against the Chaos Inc. version for the 14th time, and with each replay, his concern deepened. The mutant had killed a Chaos sorcerer through sheer electromagnetic manipulation, had collapsed an entire breach chamber without touching the warp, had weaponized a forged temple's infrastructure with the casualness of a man swatting flies. The kill count was impressive. The methodology was terrifying, because it meant Magneto could theoretically do the same thing to any Imperial facility, any warship, any installation that relied on metal, which was everything humanity had built in the last 10 millennia. Kraven leaned back in his throne, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and spoke to the shadows. "Assessment, Lex Mechanic Thorn. Can he be controlled?" From the darkness behind him, a woman's voice responded, flat and emotionless, processed through augmetic vocal cords that had replaced human ones decades ago. "Negative, my lord. Subject demonstrates autonomous decision-making, refusal to submit to imperial authority, and ideological commitment to concepts fundamentally incompatible with Imperium doctrine. Control probability 0.3%, containment probability 8.7%, termination probability variable depending on deployment assets." Kraven nodded slowly, already running through scenarios in his mind. The Imperium had protocols for dealing with uncontrolled psychers, rogue Astartes, even minor demonic incursions, but Magneto fit none of their threat models. He wasn't corrupted by chaos. Multiple scans confirmed zero warp taint. He wasn't a Xenos. Genetic analysis showed pure human DNA, albeit with impossible mutations. He wasn't even a psyker in the traditional sense. His power operated through electromagnetic manipulation of physical reality, not through warp touch. The Imperium classified threats based on how to kill them: psychers, null maidens and psychic hoods, demons, grey knights and sanctified rounds, Xenos, Deathwatch and specialized ammunition. But what did you use against someone who could turn your weapons into sculptures before you pulled the trigger? What did you deploy against a man who demonstrated capability to collapse forged temples, stop armies and kill chaos sorcerers without breaking stride? The answer, Kraven was beginning to realize, was nothing conventional. This required something extraordinary. "Prepare a message for Officio Assassinorum," Kraven said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision he knew might haunt him. Priority Alpha Terminus. Target designation: Magneto, Omega-level non-psyker anomaly. Recommended asset: Culexus Temple. Primary objective: termination. Secondary objective: recovery of remains for biologist analysis. He paused, then added with grim finality: authorization code: Exterminatus fallback. If the Culexus fails, we glass Metallica station from orbit. 40,000 tech priests are acceptable losses if it means preventing this mutant from destabilizing 3 sectors. Thorn's silhouette shifted in the shadows, processing the order. The Culexus were the Imperium's ultimate weapon against psychers, soulless blanks whose very presence made reality recoil, whose touch could unravel psychic powers at the fundamental level. Against a traditional threat, they were unstoppable. Against Magneto, they were a gamble, because nobody knew if his power would register as psychic to their anti-warp capabilities. Nobody knew if blank field suppression would affect electromagnetic manipulation. It was theory versus theory, and the stakes were an entire Forge world. But Kraven didn't have better options. The Grey Knights had engaged, and with Rawn, which meant even the Imperium's elite demon hunters couldn't guarantee victory. The Mechanicus wanted to study Magneto, which made them compromised. Standard Imperial Guard couldn't touch him, he'd proven that on Cadia. Titans were walking metal coffins waiting to be crushed. Navy bombardment was useless against someone who could bend macro cannon shells mid-flight. The only remaining option was an assassin who killed through absence rather than presence, through void rather than force. A Culexus assassin didn't fight you with weapons, it fought you by making your powers forget how to exist. And if that didn't work, there was always orbital bombardment. Lance strikes that could boil continents. Cyclonic torpedoes that cracked tectonic plates. The Imperium had been perfecting the art of killing worlds for 10,000 years. One mutant, no matter how powerful, couldn't survive planetary extinction. Could he? Kraven pushed the doubt aside and transmitted the order. The die was cast. 3 sectors away, on a fortress monastery that existed partially in real space and partially in dimensions that made geometry cry, the Culexus Temple received the order and began preparations. They selected their operative with clinical precision. Assassin designate Epsilon Null, a blank so profound that even other Culexus found her presence disturbing. She had terminated 3 Alpha Plus Psychers, walked through warp storms that killed Grey Knights, and once shut down an entire choir of astropaths just by entering the same station. Her very existence was an affront to the warp, a hole in reality that the universe tried desperately to ignore. She was given Magneto's profile, his capabilities, his known limitations. She studied them with the detached interest of a surgeon examining tumors. Then she boarded a stealth ship, activated her animus speculum, a psychic hood that focused her anti-warp aura into a killing beam, and set course for Metallica. The journey would take 6 days. Magneto had 6 days to enjoy his newfound cooperation with the Mechanicus. 6 days before the Imperium's answer arrived, wearing human skin and carrying Oblivion. Magneto, unaware of the death sentence traveling toward him at superluminal speeds, stood in a Mechanicus data cathedral, learning things that made his understanding of reality seem childish. Ven 9 had been true to his word, providing access to forbidden archives, heretical texts, suppressed data. Magneto read about the war in heaven, about the Cetan and Necrons, about wars fought before humanity existed. He learned about the Emperor, about a man who'd walked Earth for 30,000 years before revealing himself, about psychic might so profound it powered a beacon visible across the galaxy. He studied the warp, learned how emotion fed the chaos gods, how belief shaped reality, how faith could literally make the impossible happen, and with each revelation, his horror grew. This wasn't a universe. It was a meat grinder with pretensions of cosmology, where every choice led to damnation, and the only question was, which horror consumed you first? Starvation or chaos? Xenos or corruption? The Imperium's cruelty or the galaxy's indifference? You begin to understand, Ven 9 observed, his mechadendrites adjusting hololithic displays showing the Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that split the galaxy in half. Why the Imperium is as it is, why mercy is weakness, why hope is heresy. The alternative to imperial tyranny is not freedom, mutant entity, it is extinction. The Emperor's light is harsh because the darkness is absolute. The Magos gestured toward images of worlds consumed by tyrannids, populations numbering in the billions reduced to biomatter in hours, images of planets claimed by chaos, their inhabitants transformed into screaming monuments to insanity, images of Necron tomb worlds awakening, ancient machines treating organic life like cancer to be excised. You wish to liberate humanity from oppression, but humanity is not oppressed by the Imperium, it is protected by it. The oppression comes from reality itself, from a universe that wants us dead. The Imperium merely ensures we die slowly instead of quickly. Is that not worth preserving? Magneto stared at the images, feeling something break inside him. He'd spent his entire life fighting systems, believing that humanity could be better if only the right people led, if only the corrupt were removed, if only the oppressed could rise up. But in the 41st millennium, there were no right people, only survivors. The corrupt weren't anomalies, they were features of a system designed to function through brutality because kindness got you killed. And the oppressed couldn't rise up because rising up meant dropping your guard, and dropping your guard meant chaos consumed your soul while tyrannids consumed your flesh. It was a perfect trap, a closed loop of horror where every exit led to worse suffering, and the Imperium, for all its nightmares, was the only thing preventing total collapse. Magneto had fought fascists, supremacists, genocidal maniacs, but he'd never fought something like this. An evil necessary only because the alternatives were apocalyptic. How did you rebel against pragmatic atrocity? How did you demand better when better meant extinction? I don't accept that, Magneto said finally, his voice hollow but determined. I don't accept that cruelty is the only option, that lobotomizing innocence is necessary, that grinding billions into paste is the only way humanity survives. There has to be another path, a middle ground between tyranny and extinction. Ven 9's augmetic eyes flickered, processing, calculating. When he responded, his voice carried something that might have been pity or might have been disappointment. Middle grounds require resources, mutant entity, time, energy, attention. The Imperium has none of these. Every second spent seeking better solutions is a second not spent fighting the 10,000 threats trying to kill us. Every resource allocated to mercy is a resource not building warships. Every moment of compassion is a moment Char, Oz can exploit. The Magos leaned closer, his mechanical face inches from Magneto's. You want to find a better way? Then survive long enough to discover it, because the Inquisition has already decided you are too dangerous to tolerate, and they are sending something that kills by making you stop existing. Prepare yourself, Magneto. Your time as an interesting specimen has ended. Your time as a target has begun. The words hit Magneto like physical blows. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed, hearing that the Imperium had decided his death before he'd even been given a chance, ignited fury he'd been suppressing since arriving in this nightmare reality. Then I'll survive, he said quietly, dangerously. I've survived concentration camps and sentinels and gods. I'll survive your assassins too. And when I do, when I've proven I can't be killed, can't be contained, can't be controlled, then maybe you'll listen. Maybe you'll realize that someone with my power fighting for humanity instead of against it is worth more than another corpse in your archives. He turned to leave, then stopped, looking back at Ven 9 with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. You said the Omnissiah teaches that all knowledge serves the machine god. Here's some knowledge. Systems built entirely on fear and suffering don't last. They collapse. From within or without, they always collapse. The Imperium is dying, Magos, slowly, inexorably, and unless someone finds a better way, a way that doesn't require sacrificing everything that makes humanity worth saving, it will fall. And when it does, all your pragmatic cruelty won't matter, because there'll be nothing left to protect. He walked out of the data cathedral, leaving Ven 9 alone with his machines and his calculations. The Magos stood motionless for a long moment, processing Magneto's words against 10,000 years of Mechanicus doctrine. Then, so quietly that no human ear could have heard it, he whispered a single phrase in binary. Hypothesis: mutant entity is correct. Probability of imperial sustainability: declining. Probability of catastrophic systemic failure: rising. Omnissiah, preserve us. We are building our tomb and calling it a fortress. Outside, Magneto felt the metal of Metallica Station humming around him, billions of tons of potential weapons, and knew with cold certainty that the real fight, the impossible fight, was about to begin. Somewhere in the void, an assassin was coming, and after the assassin, the Inquisition, and after the Inquisition, the full might of the Imperium. He was one man against a galaxy-spanning empire, one mutant against 10,000 years of accumulated tyranny. The smart move was to run, to find a way off this station, out of this sector, maybe even out of this galaxy entirely. But Eric Lenscher had never been smart about picking fights, and deep down, beneath the fear and exhaustion and growing horror, he still believed, foolishly, impossibly, that he could make a difference. That power meant something, that one man could change the world. The 41st millennium was about to teach him how wrong he was. She came like absence given form. No fanfare, no warning, just a sudden wrongness that spread through Metallica Station like frostbite through flesh. Tech priests collapsed at their workstations, their connection to the Omnissiah severing like cut cables. Servitors froze mid-task, their minimal consciousness unable to process the void walking among them. Even the machine spirits, those fragments of awareness that inhabited blessed machinery, went silent, retreating into hibernation subroutines as if terrified of being noticed. Magneto felt it first as a pressure behind his eyes, then as a creeping numbness that spread through his electromagnetic sense like gangrene. Something was on the station that reality itself didn't want to acknowledge, something that made his powers flicker and strain like a candle in a windstorm. He was in a workshop 3 decks below Manufactorum Primus when the feeling intensified, and he looked up to find Ven 9 staring at him with every augmetic eye wide with what might have been fear. The Magos didn't need to speak. They both knew. The assassin had arrived. Magneto reached out with his power to sense the station's metal infrastructure, to map escape routes, to prepare defenses. The effort felt like pushing through mud. His electromagnetic field extended maybe 50 meters before it simply stopped, as if hitting a wall made of nothing. He pushed harder, blood vessels bursting in his nose from the strain, and gained another 10 meters of range before the exhaustion forced him to stop. Whatever was coming, it was suppressing his abilities just by existing. Not countering them, countering implied opposition, a force pushing back. This was different. This was absence, a hole in reality that his powers slid around like water avoiding a drain. He'd never felt anything like it, and the sensation triggered primal fear that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the animal brain screaming, "Run, run, run." But there was nowhere to run. The station was a closed environment, and the thing hunting him was already inside, so Magneto did what he'd always done when cornered. He prepared to fight. The Colexus assassin designated Epsilon Null moved through Metallica's corridors with the inexorable patience of death itself. She didn't rush, didn't need to. Her target couldn't escape, couldn't hide, couldn't fight what his senses couldn't properly perceive. The animus speculum on her head, a psychic hood that looked like a skull made of blackened metal, focused her anti-warp aura into a cone of absolute negation that extended 30 meters ahead. Anything psychic within that cone simply stopped functioning. Psychers collapsed into catatonia. Demons unraveled. Warp-powered artifacts became inert metal. She'd killed Alpha-plus threats with this ability, walked through psychic firestorms that incinerated continents, stood before greater demons, and watched them dissolve like salt in water. Magneto was powerful, yes, unique certainly, but ultimately he was just another aberration to be erased. Another mistake the universe had made that she was here to correct. She turned a corner and found her first obstacle. 12 Skitarii standing in defensive formation, their weapons trained on her position. They opened fire immediately. The radium rounds passed through empty space. The assassin was already gone, moving with augmented speed that made her a blur even to augmetic tracking systems. She closed the distance in 3 seconds, her phase sword, a blade that existed partially out of sync with reality, carving through the first Skitarii's torso. He fell in 2 pieces, his augmetic components sparking as his organic parts tried to process death. The others adjusted their aim, but targeting a Colexus was like trying to aim at a blind spot in your vision. Your eyes slid away. Your targeting cogitators registered error codes. Even direct observation felt like looking at something through frosted glass while drunk. 2 more Skitarii died before they managed to land a single hit, and when they did, a radium round punching through her shoulder, she barely slowed. Pain was a software problem. She'd had most of her pain receptors removed during transformation into a Colexus, replaced with tactical feedback systems that registered damage without the messy emotional response. The wound was noted, catalogued, and ignored. The Skitarii died 12 seconds after engaging. Their bodies littered the corridor like broken toys, and the assassin continued forward without breaking stride. Magneto felt the deaths through his electromagnetic sense, felt the sudden cessation of augmetic activity as the Skitarii's implants went offline. She was getting closer, moving through the station's defenses like they weren't there. He stood in the center of the workshop, surrounded by every piece of metal he could pull from the surrounding decks. Bulkheads, piping, support struts, machinery, weapons. All of it orbited him in concentric rings, moving faster and faster until the air itself ignited from friction. If she wanted him, she'd have to get through 300 tons of accelerated metal moving at speeds that would shred ceramite armor. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. The pressure behind his eyes intensified, the numbness spread, and then she was there, standing in the doorway, a figure wrapped in sinskin that drank light and wore a skull helm that looked like death's own face. The animus speculum on her forehead glowed with sickly green light, and when it focused on Magneto, his entire electromagnetic field collapsed. It wasn't gradual, wasn't a struggle. 1 second he had control over 300 tons of orbiting metal. The next, it all fell, crashed to the deck in a deafening cacophony of impact and failure. And Magneto dropped to his knees, gasping like he'd been punched in the solar plexus. His power was still there. He could feel it, sense it trying to function. but it was like trying to use a muscle that had been severed from its nerve. The connection was broken. The Culexus had done something to him, something impossible, and now he was just a man, just flesh and bone and defiance in the face of an assassin designed to kill gods. She walked toward him slowly, Faye's sword raised, and Magneto realized with absolute clarity that he was about to die. Not dramatically, not heroically, just efficiently, like an equation being solved, like a problem being corrected. This was how it ended. Murdered by something that killed by making you powerless. The irony would have been amusing if he wasn't so terrified. He tried to stand, to fight, to do something other than kneel like a condemned man awaiting the axe. His legs wouldn't cooperate. The Culexus's aura was like psychic novocaine, numbing everything that made him more than human, leaving only the frightened child who'd watched his mother die in Auschwitz and sworn never to be helpless again. But he was helpless now. The assassin raised her blade. The animus speculum's light intensified, and then Ven 9 stepped between them. The Magos didn't attack, didn't threaten, just stood there, his mechadendrites spread wide in a posture that might have been protective or might have been pleading. When he spoke, his voice was pure binaric cant directed at the assassin, too fast and complex for human ears to pass. But Magneto understood the tone. Desperation. The kind that came from watching something valuable about to be destroyed. The Culexus paused, her skull helm tilting as if considering. Then she responded in the same binaric language, and Magneto knew with the certainty of someone who'd spent decades learning to read body language and tone, that she was saying no. Orders were absolute, the target would be terminated, obstacles would be removed. Ven 9's mechadendrites drooped, and for a moment the Magos looked almost human, almost vulnerable. Then his body language shifted, augmetics reconfiguring for combat, and he attacked the assassin with every weapon in his arsenal. Plasma cutters, arc welders, graviton hammers, industrial equipment repurposed for violence, wielded by someone who'd spent 2 centuries learning to fight in the Omnissiah's name. The Culexus moved like liquid shadow, her phase sword deflecting attacks that should have been impossible to perceive, her movements guided by centuries of training and augmentation that made her faster than thought. She cut through 2 mechadendrites, severed a power cable feeding Ven 9's weapon systems, and was positioning for a killing strike when Magneto's power suddenly surged back. Not fully, maybe 20% of his normal capacity, but it was enough. He grabbed the assassin with magnetic force, pulled her off balance, and Ven 9's plasma cutter took her in the chest. The Culexus staggered, skin burning, the hit breaking her concentration just enough that her animus speculum's focus wavered. Magneto's power flooded back like dam breaking.